When a discussion among friends, as always, turns to Luftwaffe bombers, it usually takes less than a minute before very plucky statements emerge. Statements such as, the Germans were stupid not to build 4-engine bombers, or after the death of General Walter Weber, it all fell to pieces and Germany swung over to close air support. Or simply, my favorite, the Germans didn't want bombers because, well, insert reason here. Let's crack open this egg, shall we? Welcome to the Luftwaffe at War. Let's open up with a round of quick fire answers. First, were the Germans stupid for not building 4-engine bombers? No, they had very rational reasons. Second, did the death of Walter Weber mean the end of the German bomber effort? No, the impact of his death is vastly overstated. And finally, did Germans not want any bombers? No, they wanted them, and they wanted a lot of them. Now, these answers are not revolutionary. Even a cursory glance at the German source documents shows this, and notable historians from the 12-volume Das Deutsche Reich und der Zweite Weltkrieg over to James Corum's Operational Air War have shed light on this. Not in its entirety, I would say, but enough to clearly demonstrate that things are different than we find in the popular retelling of the story on TV, film, or more seriously in the 21st century, on YouTube. In this episode, I will demonstrate that the Germans considered the bomber to be, yes, to be the main striking arm of the Luftwaffe, and that it was considered the most important plane of them all. In the future, I shall then dive deeper into the 4-engine bomber discussion, Walter Weber himself, aircraft like the Heinkel 111, the Junkers 88, and even the, I'll be frank here, over-exaggerated America bomber project, which was so fanciful and impractical that to this day I do not understand why so many people are obsessed with it. Today's episode sets the foundation for all of that. Strap in, it's about to get certifiably Teutonic. And talking of our episodes, my research, including all archive trips, are supported by patrons and channel members. Supporters get upcoming episodes early, can vote on topics, and have priority access to Q&As. And you can get these bonuses too by signing up on patreon.com/millavhistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. Thanks to Michael and Kevin who recently signed up. In the opening episode to The Luftwaffe at War, I discussed the Luftwaffe's doctrine. I won't go over that again here, so an executive summary for what we need today is in order. The Luftwaffe has 3 overarching missions: engage and destroy the enemy air force, support army and navy operations, and strike both the origins of power of the enemy military and its linkages to the front lines. That's it. That is of course a very broad range of missions, and we can interpret many things onto it, which is likely the reason why so many times it is portrayed completely wrong. But if you listen to that particular episode, you will already know that I hinted at the fact that the bomber was considered the primary tool of the Luftwaffe to make all of this happen. Let's get real. How could it be any other way in the 1930s? After all, this is the interwar period we are talking about, and, mild spoilers ahead, the bomber carries bombs. Yes, preferably a lot, and preferably big ones. And bombs are used to destroy stuff. I know, this is mind-blowing stuff. In a time without ICBMs, cruise missiles or long precision fires, the bomber was the only way to bring firepower to bear at range and scale. And the Germans agreed. Very much agreed. And they went full in. These are the people that did not stop bomber production until the summer of 1944, when Allied bombers were pounding the Reich day in, day out. I know, in the aftermath of German wartime propaganda, the Blitzkrieg myth, comparisons to the Allied combined bomber offensive, it is easy to think bombers didn't matter to the Germans. But then why does Germany have 1,200 bombers out of 4,000 aircraft that are operational for the Battle of Poland? Why are there 1,800 bombers out of a force of 5,400 for France? And 760 out of 2,800 for Operation Barbarossa. And the dive bomber numbers are about 350 for each campaign. And as the dive bomber was regarded to be a more precise bomber, not a close air support aircraft, these numbers actually compound. So, at all times, between 1939 to 1941, about 40% of the Luftwaffe were bombers, and the rest was made up of reconnaissance, fighters, heavy fighters, transporters, and, well, about 40 close air support biplanes. Quite simply, the Luftwaffe was a bomber force, no doubt about it. To the basic consensus that the bomber carries bombs to destroy stuff, we also have to add the interwar context, the imagination of the time, the operations and technology which influenced the Germans. So let us talk about that and then loop back to the German bomber theory. You will have heard the saying, "The bomber will always come through," from Stanley Baldwin's 1932 speech in the British House of Parliament. Stanley Baldwin's original intent was to issue a warning. This was a call for disarmament. Baldwin did not want more bombers exactly because he saw them as invincible and indiscriminate in their destruction. But his punchline was a double-edged sword and was appropriated even at the time. It became a call to build more bombers, not less, because they were perceived to be so effective. Now there are two ways to interpret Baldwin's words once they were appropriated by the bomber supporters, but both lead to the same outcome: more bombers. The first is in line with what Baldwin directly referenced. As a politician giving a speech in Parliament, he knew he had to draw up an image and appeal to human emotion in order to captivate the audience and gain support. Thus he built up this visual image: bombers flying high over a country, and no AA gun or fighter can take them down. The bomber remains undefeated and blows the target into oblivion. Simply put, Baldwin conjures the image of invincibility. In the fight for public opinion, such visual images, the imagination behind them, and the emotions attached to them, they reign supreme. But Baldwin and his contemporaries had a point in the early 1930s. Bombers, because of their importance and complexity, were at the forefront of technological progress. Bombers in the 1930s were faster than fighters, had more guns, and with their range seemed to be able to strike anywhere. Fighters were barely able to do anything against them. Consider this. In 1932, the year of Baldwin's speech, the American B-10 bomber had its first flight. This was the first all-metal monoplane bomber to go into series production, a huge leap forward for aviation, and within a year or two, it was already obsolete, surpassed by even more powerful bomber designs. And only 6 years after the Bolo, the famous B-17 Flying Fortress had its first flight. This speed of aeronautical development was something like never seen before. And fighters during this time, well, fighters developed much slower. Fighters only shoot at planes. Now that seems critical now, but because they don't destroy stuff on the ground, they cannot influence the war directly. So why prioritize them? And when the performance window suddenly opened up with the advent of early high-performance monoplane fighters like the Soviet Polikarpov I-16 or the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the firepower was still sorely lacking against bombers. During the Spanish Civil War, the bomber might not have been as effective as anticipated, but it certainly triumphed over the fighter, because the fighters during the Spanish Civil War had a really hard time taking on the bombers. And in fact, biplanes were only being phased out at the start of World War II, and in many cases they remained in service during the early war. The bomber at this point had a full generational head start over fighters, and it did not pass by the Germans. But I said that there was another way to interpret the saying, albeit with the same conclusion. This is not a visual interpretation, it's more conceptual, big picture. But equally, I believe that it is far more representative of how air forces planned at the time. For this, the quote, "the bomber will always come through," was a statement of belief. Not that every single bomber aircraft is invincible, but that the bomber is the only means to an end for an air force. Would bombers be shot down in action? Yeah, sure. But ultimately it is the only tool that allows an air force to strike targets at range and scale, and as such it would come through in delivering the anticipated goal, the vanquishing of the enemy. Ergo, For an air force, there would be no victory without bombers. And if an air force could not bring victory or significantly contribute towards it as a single branch of the armed forces, why would you then need an air force? May as well cut their funding or worse, fold them back into the army. Shudder, horror, gasp. No, my friends, as I mentioned so many times in the past, the bomber is intertwined with what it meant to be an air force in the 1930s and 1940s. Did some bomber advocates go overboard in their claims? Yes, absolutely. But this does not change the basic fact that for an air force, in order to fight both a war and to defend its status as an independent branch of the armed forces, the bomber was the only way to go. Now the question might now pop up, what about the Soviet Air Force? And I will say that the tactical focus of the Soviets during World War II glosses over a lot of history and doctrine concerning bombers in the Soviet Union during the interwar period. And thus, with the conceptual groundwork ticked off, we can turn now to the German bomber concept. Earlier I mentioned these mission targets for the Luftwaffe, and more specifically, these enigmatic centers of power that the Luftwaffe was to strike. These centers were the origin, fabric and network that generated the military power of a nation. And yes, that's an incredibly academic way to describe it. So in a nutshell, destroy the centers of power and the linkages to the front, and the enemy army will be incapable to resist a ground offensive. But what were these centers in detail? Let me quote from a German period document. Quote, "By fighting against the enemy's military sources of power and by diverting the flow of power from them to the front, including all means of transport and routes, the Luftwaffe seeks to bring the enemy Wehrmacht to a standstill. These centers of power include all of the enemy's facilities and arrangements that serve to strengthen and increase their fighting force. They are essentially fixed local facilities." End quote. This document then continues to list all categories of primary targets, about 30 of them. I'll sum them up here for your convenience. Airfields of all kinds, Air Force headquarters and administrative buildings, Air Force stockpiles and logistics centers, Army assembly areas and bases, railheads and rail infrastructure, troop movements and the road network, Army positions outside the range of artillery, an enemy nation's industry, its energy plants and network, and the infrastructure surrounding that. The same for stockpiles, for critical raw resources and food, and finally, vital harbors and ports. Yes, that was a summary, not the full list and all the sub-entries. I might be German, but years abroad have tempered my impulse to be overly precise when it is not required, in favor of brevity and ease of understanding. Anywho, you will have noticed that there is not much left that one could add as bomber targets, but equally that the traditional picture we have of bomber attacks, mainly against factories and resources, is only one part of this list. And they come at the very end. This is, by the way, the original order, and maybe it is merely accidental, but somehow I don't think so. If you look at this list, it actually seems to prioritize first control of the air by knocking out airfields, then the operational targets to undermine the enemy's army ability to maneuver, and then the nation's industry. It's almost like this is a step-by-step guide on what to do. But wasn't attacking industry considered important by the Germans? Yes, but the effect of that could be delayed by weeks, even months. The Luftwaffe was planning for short, decisive continental campaigns, and for this it needed a bomber force that did one specific thing: outsortie and outbomb one country at a time, one operation at a time. As Göring was quoted saying, quote, "The Führer does not ask me what bombers we have, but how many." End quote. This was both to show strength, remember the appropriated saying of "the bomber will always come through," and for industrial reasons. Next to the inability of the German industry in the 1930s to build large, four-engine bombers, the operational reality was that Germany needed to knock out its intended adversaries in Europe quickly, one after the other, preferably while deterring the other countries to attack them in the Germans' weak flank. An all-front war Germany could never win. So, to build this force, it needed to find the right balance of its bombers. How many can Germany build? What basing requirements do they have? What resource investments are needed? And do they have enough of a payload to act as the carriers of air power in short campaigns? Et voila, we have the medium bomber and interdiction operations. This was the only realistic way for Germany to be able to wage a war on its own terms. As always, to understand why a country did X, Y, or Z, it serves not to compare them to others that have a completely different context. To understand a country's decisions, one must understand their perspective, aims, resources, capacities, and constraints. For Germany, a country that was hell-bent on unleashing war in Europe, it was medium bombers and it became interdiction. Those are the words to take away from this. Finally, let me say something about German bomber operations and their cooperation with the army, especially in the early period of the war. Arguably, before 1943, the bomber was the main tool to support the army by supporting ground operations that were considered decisive to a campaign's end. This is why the Luftwaffe was focused on supporting key thrusts in their attack on Poland, France, the Soviet Union. Take, for example, the crossing of the Meuse at Sedan in 1940. Here, the Luftwaffe did what it was meant to do, out-sortie and out-bomb their French counterparts in one specific area of the front line. It sealed off the battlefield for the remainder of the French army and destroyed the cohesion of the French troops inside by going after assembly areas, communication centers, headquarters, logistics, stockpiles, lines of retreat, and so on. Sedan was a close-run thing. We know this nowadays. The French actually do not get the credit they deserve for many a valiant action. But what swung the pendulum in the Germans' favor was in no small part that these courageous French actions were never part of a cohesive effort and depended on the initiative of exhausted individual units that made them far less effective. The Luftwaffe's interdiction was the main reason for this, building up situation awareness with constant reconnaissance, bombing critical targets, and eroding the French army's ability to act as one. Why does this matter when I talk about bombers? Well, Sedan is often linked to the Ju-87 Stuka because of two things. First, the opening attacks against French fortifications, and because one specific French general provided a very juicy quote for historians to use. And while his experience may have been so, and his artillery unit may have been running away from their guns when the Stukas attacked, first of all, who can blame them? And second of all, that does not make a battle. The Ju-87 was far less effective at Sedan than the bombers, and it flew way less sorties. Ju-87 sorties were equaling out at roughly 300, whereas the bombers flew more than 10 times that amount of sorties, against any sort of battlefield target that was mentioned before. Operations like the one at Sedan proved to the Germans that their concept of operational air support brought about by bombers and dive bombers worked for the way that they wanted to conduct the campaigns. Yes, they still had to refine it, and yes, one of the lessons of this was that far tighter cooperation with the army is still necessary, and the structures to build those only emerged 2 years later. And that was my spiel about German bombers, to set the foundation for future episodes. As we have learned, the bomber was king and queen for the Luftwaffe, and as such, it might be a good idea to bookmark this one. And I have a feeling that as I look at certain bomber operations of the Luftwaffe and the aircraft like the Heinkel 111, I will certainly be referring back to this episode here and there. Join me next time on The Luftwaffe at War as we dive deeper into the Luftwaffe's operations, aircraft and thinking during World War II. The show is written and produced by me, Christoph Bergs, and if you want to get a hold of future episodes early, vote on topics and get priority access to Q&As, become a supporter of The Luftwaffe at War at patreon.com/milavhistory or via YouTube memberships on Military Aviation History. A big thank you goes to all the supporters for making this possible. As always, thank you for joining me today and have a great day and see you in the sky.